Welcome to Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents, a conversation with R.G. Belsky. R.G. Belsky, better known as Dick Belsky, is a longtime journalist and mystery novelist. He is the author of the 3 books in the Clare Carlson series, of which the latest one, The Last Scoop, was just released. Dick, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, yeah, Bill, thanks for having me. And it's good to be here, but of course, I'd rather be at the Mechanicsburg bookstore in person. I've made a number of visits there to their events, and it's always been great. But you know, this is how we're operating in these days. So we'll do the best we can.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Dick, how did you move from being you were a longtime journalist? I should tell our folks, you were a former managing editor at the New York Daily News, Metro editor, deputy national editor. You worked for the Star tabloid magazine as a news editor, and then worked at NBCnews.com, apparently working with like the nightly news with Brian Williams, the Today Show. You've had this great journalism career. What made you turn to novel writing?
Well, I didn't really turn to it. People think, so I was in journalism 40 years from, started out, young and stayed through until I left NBC a few years ago. And now I've written 14 novels. This is The Last Scoop, which is the book we're talking about that just came out, is my 14th. And so the thing is like, oh, so you decided to leave journalism and write novels. And I mean, that's not really what happened. I've been writing novels all the time I was a journalist. My first novel was actually published back in 1985, I think, and then I published about 7 of them while I was working full time. And I've always been drawn to the novel writing, and I think one of the reasons it's because I'm writing mysteries. It's like the opposite of what I'm doing in my job. In my job, I'm like, dealing with facts, and I have to always make sure that everything is accurate and right. And this idea of being able to write about crime but make stuff up, that's always been fun. And I've done a lot of rip from the headline stuff, and where you take a crime and and then you put a twist on it, and I've done it. I mean, like I did it with like even something as simple as, not as simple, but as tragically basic as John Lennon's murder. Okay, he was killed by a crazy stalker, Mark David Chapman. Well, I wrote a whole book. Well, what if a celebrity was murdered like that, but that wasn't it, and there was a whole other thing going on? So it gives you an opportunity to get answers that you don't always get as a journalist.
Yes, I noticed that in the Last Scoop, because you have a murder that took place like 30 years ago in Indiana that was never solved, and this kind of gave you a chance to treat it your own way.
Yeah, there's two basic real life elements in The Last Scoop, my new book, and basically it was inspired by the fact that as a very young journalist, I was here during this Summer of Sam, when Son of Sam, it killed 6 people and wounded 7 others in this terrorist spree through New York, and probably still became the most, and not in terms of numbers, but it's the most infamous serial killer ever, the one that everybody is based on. And so my book is about my character, Clare Carlson, a TV journalist chasing a serial killer, but I wanted to, twist it and make it a different kind of serial killer. So Son of Sam was the classic kind we see in movies and books, who's writing notes to the media and taunting the police and telling how many people he's killed and how many he's going to kill. And my serial killer in the book is like a totally under the radar. And the point is, he's been murdering people for like 30 years, murdered up to 20 people, and nobody ever made the connection because they all thought they were individual murders. And I thought that was just an interesting angle, and it's, Claire puts that together and then goes after the serial killer. And the other murder you referred to, so the first murder in the chain that gets her going is a murder of a young girl in a small town in Indiana that was never solved. And that was actually inspired by the fact that when I was growing up in suburban Cleveland, there was a very famous murder there in the 60s of a young girl in a house in a totally safe suburban neighborhood, and somebody like murdered her in her bed. No one ever solved it. And it, by far the biggest crime that ever happened, in my community when I was a kid, and it was never solved. And I'm going back time and time again, just checking, and it's like one of those cold cases that will probably never be solved. So again, I'm a novelist, so I'm like, well, I'm going to solve it, So it's not that case, but it's a case like that, and I took that and I came up with a reason for it. So most of my books have those elements, but of course, it's all fiction because you can't just repeat the story. You then have to put your own twist on it and make it interesting to the reader.
Yeah, yeah. Now, your heroine, Clare Carlson, is kind of an interesting character among journalism heroes in mysteries because she's kind of a producer. So she's somewhat of management, but she's also breaking stories at the same time. And it's an interesting mix.
Yeah, well, a lot of times people say that, oh, that's really brilliant. You made her a news director. It's not. A lot of times things aren't for any reason. You stumble into things. So, but before that, let me just explain for people who haven't read the Clare Carlson series. This is the third, and yeah, she's a TV journalist in New York, and she basically combines a lot of the elements, good and bad, of so many journalists I work with over the years, which, and probably even some of my own elements, which is this tremendous energy and integrity and determination to break the big story and the competitiveness against the other media. And she's really, really good at her job. But, it's difficult to be good at everything. And so her personal life is kind of a nightmare and a mess, and she makes a lot of bad decisions, and she's a very flawed character, which I love. And I've had people say, like, there are parts I really like her, but there are other times I just want to like shake her and throttle her because she makes me so mad by doing stupid things. And I figure, okay, well, I've done a good job as an author then, because I've gotten those emotions out of you. And so, yeah, she's news director of the station. And the reason she is because the first book in the series, which is called Yesterday's News, was originally going to be a standalone. It was not meant to be a series, and it kind of worked for the book that she was the news director. And then when that book was finished, the publishers, the people I work for, put the books out in Ocean View. They called me up and they're like, well, what's the next one going to be? You're going to do a series, right? And of course, like any author, you're like, oh yeah, absolutely. So suddenly Claire became a series. This is the third, there's more coming. But now I had her as news director. And, as I'm sure you know, Bill, news directors don't go out and chase stories. So you got to kind of figure out a way why she's out on the street. So in every book, I've had to like figure out a reason. And in this book, it's because like a mentor of hers is killed and murdered. And so she feels personal responsibility to look into it herself. I think it's a little, I guess you could compare it a little bit like McMillan and Wife, the TV show, because he was the police commissioner, but he would be out, with Susan St. James doing stories. But again, it wasn't intentional. But I think with any mystery, you need to, you gotta have that suspension of belief, because I've made the point in a number of interviews that in all my years in journalism, I don't ever remember one case in which a journalist single-handedly solved a murder, ever. They may work with the police or whatever, but no journalist has ever solved a murder that I knew. And yet in my book, it happens every book, and in everybody else's journalist book, because it's fiction, and I can't have Claire sitting in an office. I need to have her out there doing stuff. So it's a challenge, but so far I think I've hopefully been able to pull it off.
Oh yeah, but it's also a case where she's not only dealing with, of course, the breaking news, but she's having to deal with management. She's having to deal with a consultant that came in.
And that's fun.
And the on-air anchors I thought was particularly funny.
Yeah. I have two on-air anchors, and they have an affair. There's also, and they're jealous of each other, and so a lot of this comes from my own background, because I was. I mean, everyone starts out as a reporter. Most of my career, I was a manager running people. And one of the favorite things that I love to do in these books is to write the news meeting, because the news meeting is where everybody at a newspaper or TV, they get together and they talk about their stories, and there's, all the colorful stuff going on. And then if you think back even like something like All the President's Men, you see Ben Bradley with his feet up. I've been in a million of those meetings, and that is that is what I try and bring to this book, the kind of insanity of these meetings, not just the news, but the colorful stuff that goes on, the crazy arguments that go on. And when I've been doing a lot of times somebody will read this and they'll be like, oh, well, that would never happen. I was like, oh yeah, because it did, because I was at a meeting where somebody did something even crazier. So, so that's a lot of fun. But the other thing about Claire to remember for people who haven't read it is, so she's basically a newspaper reporter. She started as a newspaper reporter. So she brings like a real news values to it, as opposed to somebody who's started out in TV. And as a newspaper person, I wanted her to have that. I didn't want her just to be a TV person. So there's a lot of times she gets very frustrated with the TV news business because it's not the way she remembers newspapers being. But of course, as we know, newspapers aren't the way they were anyway now, and so she has to deal with a lot of this, the change in what's going on in the media around us.
Yeah, and Claire also, that's the one thing that impressed me about reading The Last Scoop, is how packed with story there is, because there's a backstory to Claire as well that plays out over the 3 books. Yeah. And I thought that you were very effective in juggling all these storylines so that we're always with you, and we're always with Claire as she's going through the book.
Well, when you write a series, that's always an issue, and it becomes a bigger issue as the series goes on, and the more you have more books, because on the one hand, and I've really tried to do this, and I believe I've succeeded because a lot of people have said it, this book can be read as a standalone. I mean, you can pick up The Last Scoop and you don't have to have read the first 2, and you get it, because the story is, the main plot is completely on its own. But obviously there has to be references to things that have happened to Claire in the past, and you want to throw these in so they kind of are intriguing to the reader, even though the reader may not know exactly what it's all about. And at the same time, you want to avoid like spoilers of things that might have happened in the first 2 books. So if they go back and read them, so people will say, well, should I start at the first book and read all 3? And like in an ideal situation, I would say, yeah, I think that's true of any series. But I read a lot of series, and whether it be Harry Bosch or I read all the Kinsey movies. I'm a big series person. When I get somebody I love and I just keep reading them, and the thing about that is you can read a book and you can read it out of order, and it shouldn't bother you. It does get with every book it gets harder, and you have to keep going back to check, say, well, what did I say now? How old was that kid in the first book? And because some reader is going to point, and has pointed out to me, like, you got something wrong, like you did this in this book, so.
Yeah, and I think it's more important, I guess it was more important to point out, I don't want to say there's no surprises in Claire's story, but what the problem is. You're just looking at her resolving it. It's more about the journey than the revelation of what happened in Claire's life 30 years ago, in a way. So that's why you can jump in.
I mean, right, in terms of her personal story, in terms of the plot, there's a lot of twists, and generally in The Last Scoop, as in most of the books, she herself is in some kind of jeopardy. And of course, as many authors have pointed out, I mean, one of the things of doing a series is, though, so if I'm doing a standalone, there's always the possibility that my protagonist is going to get killed at the end of the book. I mean, that is possible. If you're doing a series, you kind of pretty know. I mean, like when you're reading Lee Child, you're pretty sure Jack Reacher, no matter what trouble he's in, is going to get out of it. I mean, unless somebody was going to make a dramatic end to the series, which, but you still want to put the person in jeopardy, because I think in most books, I mean, I'm the kind of person who writes a mystery where, it's not all cerebral. A lot of it is, but, there's got to be certain kinds of violent confrontation. There's got to be threats. I generally have some sort of a showdown at the end. It's not a closed room mystery where Claire gets in a room and goes around the room and tells people. It's more going to be like a car chase or a gunfight or something like that.
Yeah, and in scenes like those, it's always a question, not will she survive it, but how does she get herself out of that situation? That's what makes it tense.
In the last scoop, as without giving away spoilers, I mean, she winds up in a confrontation with this serial killer, and I think it's pretty interesting, I thought, and but that's the biggest part of a book. I mean, when you're writing the book, the beginning is easy. You sort of set up, and then you kind of got to go through all the middle and set up. I generally be asking a million, like I raise all these questions that I figure out I got to answer at the end. But then one of the biggest things for a mystery, at least the kind of mysteries that I write and I read, is you gotta have a big ending. You've got to have a confrontation of some kind. That's not just her. Turning to somebody in the room and saying, "Oh, I know you did it," and that's it. So that, and I think in this book, even more than the others, I mean, the climax at the end and the confrontation is pretty dramatic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another element that sets Claire apart is her relationship with the truth, because she starts and ends the book talking about lies and talking about truth, both in regard to the news business and herself. And she's very concerned about the truth, but also how she decides to use it, because sometimes she doesn't tell the truth.
Yeah, no. Well, she does a lot of things. I mean, she's somebody said, for somebody who's so concerned about the truth, she lies a lot, and she's also what is, I believe, what has become a kind of popular term these days, really since Gone Girl, is she's very much a unreliable narrator, because a lot of times it's not like she's lying to the reader, because it's all coming through Claire's voice. It's just she's not telling you everything. She's telling you, so you think you know the truth, but you don't know the whole truth. And that certainly started with the first book. But the bottom line is, in terms of basic integrity, she's got it. I mean, she really believes in the truth. She really believes in integrity, even though it sometimes takes her a while to figure out the best way to get that. And that all comes because when I was creating the character, and you and I were talking earlier, Bill, and you had some questions for me about, like, well, how did you start out? What did you read? Well, I started out reading, Raymond Chandler. That was the first mystery I ever read. So I started reading Philip Marlowe. And the one thing that comes across with Philip Marlowe, apart from all the other wonderful stuff Chandler did, was the integrity. I mean, for whatever word, he was he was this honest guy who always did the right thing, even if it was against the law, but he was doing the right thing. And even in, TV people, I mean, my favorite crime TV show, still watch it, reruns, is the Rockford Files, because Jim Rockford, he would break the law, he would break into stuff, but he was, he was basically this good, honest guy. And if you think about it, most of the people, the heroes, mystery heroes, certainly ones, I mean, you look at Matt Scudder, Kinsey Malone, Spencer. I mean, Spencer's like from Robert B. Parker. He's like almost like an old knight. I mean, doing the right thing no matter what, even though he kills people and does stuff. So that element was the most important thing. And that's why I have her talk about the integrity a lot, because so when she does something wrong, or when she lies, or when she breaks into something or breaks the law to do something, I want people to accept it, because they know that she's basically a good person, and basically they like her. And to some degree, I like to think that all Claire's flaws make her actually more likable than if she didn't have them. Because, I mean, let's face it. I mean, who likes a character who's perfect? I mean, we like the flaws in our people, I think. I do, and because I think it helps us relate to them.
Yeah, it's like, who do you want to follow, Superman or Batman? Superman, yeah, he's a wonderful guy, but Batman has cool stuff.
Well, I tell this. I've told this story because I always remember it. I was on a panel with a number of years ago, where I met Reed Farrell Coleman. And Reed Farrell Coleman has done a lot of great books, but he was writing the Jesse Stone series for the Robert Parker estate after Robert Parker died. And he was saying that writing Jesse Stone was one of the toughest characters to write. And the question, well, why? Because he's so good. He's so perfect. I mean, you think about it, Jesse Stone, he's good looking, he's tough, he's smart, he's got integrity, he's a great guy, and he looks like Tom Selleck, because when you're reading the books, we're all seeing the TV movies with Tom Selleck. So, you know, so Reed would say, so how do you do that character? Well, you give him flaws. So he's an alcohol, he's got a drinking problem, which gets him screwed up. He's got a marital problem. He wound up divorced. He misses his wife, you know. He had a big athletic career, but it got tragically short-circuited because of an injury, you know. So you need to do these things, even in the most perfect person, because the flaws are what make them real.
Yeah, yeah, and it certainly makes for much more compelling reading as well, because they do things that sometimes, like when Claire's barging into the DA's office, going past. I shouldn't say this, but Chad was such a wonderful character. You wanted to say, you know, yes, she's breaking social boundaries, but she's doing it in a good cause, and she shows up that idiot, and you just go, yes, that's great.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of what Claire does and says that as I'm writing them, I'm thinking, yeah, I wish I had the guts to do that. Like I would never do in real life, but when you're doing it in in a character, it's kind of fun. I mean, you know, like she'll threaten to quit or something unless something's done, and like I wouldn't do that in real life. I wasn't going to walk away. But it's a kind of a cool thing in the thing. But again, it's fiction, and if you do, and you know, Bill, you were a journalist, and you know this. People always say, oh well, this is a real authentic look at what a journalist's life is like, and I'm like, well, not really, because you know, to be honest, most journalists' life are kind of boring. I mean, you go to work every day, you do some stories. It's like, you know, you don't have a big story every day. You know. It's like any job, you know. There are days, you know, you don't feel like being there, but I mean, in a mystery novel, you go in, there's a story, there's something happening, because that's, you know, that's just what fiction is. So it's kind of like the life of a journalist as I imagine it, and I certainly bring in real life things from it, but you know, day to day, my life in journalism was not as interesting as Clare Carlson's.
Yeah, that's true. You're on the periphery of events, because you helped at the Star. You helped direct the coverage of the O.J. murder case. You had you were part of the Headless Body and Topless Bar story, even though you didn't write the headline.
Oh, I did a lot of great things. Yeah, you know, I've been involved in a lot of. Yeah, Headless Body and Topless Bar was, I didn't write it, but I was part of that whole story, and that became the most famous New York Post headline ever. Yeah, so, but it's like, that would be one day. So in a mystery novel, you're kind of like, so you take an OJ and Headless Body and all these other great things that I was involved in, and you kind of put them together into one big thing, because, you know, in between all these events, there's a lot of days when you're covering Board of Estimate meetings or something, which are, you know, not the kind of thing that would pages turning in a mystery novel. You know?
Yeah, but in a way, what Claire does for part of the story when she's not directly investigating, you did with the Headless Body thing, because without your pushing the reporters to confirm something, you wouldn't have had that wonderful headline, right?
Yeah, well, the short story on that is, and I've written about this. Somebody wants to go online and Google me and Headless Body, because I've actually written about this a couple times for NBC and other places, because it became so famous. But the managing editor at the time, a man named Vincent Muzzetta, who was like probably the most famous headline writer of all the tabloid headlines at the Post. He wrote many of the great ones. And he had this great idea. I walked in the morning, it was like 6 o'clock. He walks over to me, I've got this great headline. There's a body in a bar or whatever. I want to do, and the head was cut off. And I want to write a headline, Headless Body and Topless Bar. And everybody's, oh, it's a great headline. And then he said, but I'm not sure it's a topless bar. I think it is, but I'm not sure. You got to find out. So we spent the rest of the day. Now, it isn't like today where you just Google it and you look online and you find YouTube's. It wasn't like that. I mean, there was nothing like that. You had to do all the old-fashioned stuff. You had to get a reverse directory. And you had to call people in the neighborhood and see what they knew. And you had to, and eventually you got to call the police. They weren't sure, because it wasn't a topless bar per se, but they might have had some topless dancing there. And in the end, I sent a reporter there, Marilyn Matlick, and she's part of this story too, a terrific reporter I worked with at the Post. And this would have been 1983, I think. I sent her there, and she said, look, it's all closed up. There's no indication of top. There's, I don't know, there's nothing here that indicates it's topless dancing. It's just a bar and it's closed. And she said, well, let me try one more thing. And she went around the back and she crawled up on a garbage can and peered in a dirty window. And she saw a sign that said topless dancing tonight. And so she called me, and that was it. And the headline went. So and people still talk about that headline today. So, and then, so it's just, it's just funny how things work out.
Oh, absolutely. And I spent 23 years on the copy desk writing headlines, and I wish I had one as good as that. Unfortunately, it just never came.
I think there's an argument. The argument has always been that the maybe the best tabloid headline, which I was involved in, was the Daily News in the 70s when it was Ford to New York dropped dead. And that was always, that was on, when they asked for money, Ford to New York, dropped dead. And that is a classic. And then Headless Body on a different level is a classic. But and those are probably the two most famous tabloid headlines that I remember, in my career. Now, there were a million. I mean, we had so many tabloid headlines, many of them brilliant, many of them probably not in the best of taste, and some of them were just coming. I remember we had one with Gaddafi goes daffy, stuff like that, just all this stuff, but it would grab people in, and we would sell a million. I think we sold close to 1 million copies a day in the 80s, and that's where people got all their news. They got their news from newspapers because not only was there no internet, but there weren't really any news channels then. I mean, there was the beginnings of CNN, but you didn't have 24-hour news everywhere. You had the local channels, the network news, at night, and you had newspapers.
Yeah, and
it was great.
Yeah,
it was great.
Well, so I think in a way that what the Clare Carlson series does, and your other journalism-related books, is you take a career, maybe a career of 5 reporters, and kind of mush them down to all the highlights, because it does take something.
Yeah.
Because journalists, in order to be good, have to have, like the reporter you sent to the bar, you have to be able to kind of do a little bit of rule bending, boundary breaking, initiative, and sometimes just sheer balls to do something. And that's journalism is a different profession from anything else.
It is and so much what I try and yes, the answer is yes. I do basically mush a lot of people together because the question everybody asks me is like, oh, is that me? Is that supposed to be me? Is Clare Carlson me, or is that And the point is, it never. I mean, it is. There are elements of certain people. I know who they are, but every once in a while, I'll use anecdotes that people have done or stories about people in here, and somebody will be like, oh my gosh, that was me, and then I'll say to them, yeah, I took that from you. And one of my favorite ones, I think very quickly is we had a very young reporter on tryout named Ann Bollinger, who's now a journalism professor and became a great reporter. But she was on tryout, didn't know who she was. She was some kid who came in on tryout, and we were trying to get an interview, and nobody could get the interview. And she walked over to me and said, I got the interview. And we ran it. It was like a big page, one story. And I walked over to her afterwards. And I said, how did you get that interview? That person wasn't going to talk to anybody. And she said, well, I called them up and they hung up on me. I said, okay. She said, so I called them again. And I said, what happened? They hung up. Anyway, it goes on like this. And she said, I called them 13 times and they hung up every time. And I was like, so how did you get the interview? So on the 14th call, they talked to me. And I was always struck by that. Like, how do you know that would have made 14 phone calls? I mean, most people would have made 1, maybe 2. They would have stopped you know, and that this woman had the tenacity to just keep at it through 14 phone calls and get the story. So I use that story in one of my books, and I try and convey that feeling too of what it's like to be a journalist especially in New York, where there's so much competition and there's so much like I want to get the story first, and there's so much pressure to do that. More than anything, I think that's what I hope comes through in these books, that you get this feel of what a kind of crazy world that Clare Carlson lives in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So are we going to hear more from Clare in the future?
Yes, I hope so. So, yeah, here's the last scoop. I think you're going to see it. There it is.
Yep.
That just came out in in May 5th, actually. There will be another Clare Carlson next year called Beyond the Headlines, and I've actually finished that, and it's actually off to the publishers now. And that'll be out in the spring of whatever it is, 2021. And again, it's called Beyond the Headlines, and that's, Clare again doing her thing. That involves a kind of super celebrity who marries a billionaire, and the billionaire winds up murdered on the first pages of the book. And Clare basically has to decide whether the super celebrity killed him or she's being railroaded, and it leads her into all sorts of adventures. And there also will be another one after that. So we're, I'm just getting started with which would be like a fifth Clare for after that. So she's gonna be around a while, I hope, and I hope people enjoy it. And like I say, if you read one, you can always go back and start at the beginning, or you can start at the beginning. But I think The Last Scoop works enough as a standalone story about a serial killer that you can, if you haven't read any, you can just pick that one up and then go from there.
Yeah, it worked for me. And because we're sponsored by Mechanicsburg, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that you have another series, an earlier series featuring Gil Malloy, of which we have a couple of copies of those books available at Mechanicsburg.
Gil Malloy is also a newspaper. I tend to write about what I know. Gil Malloy is a newspaper reporter who works for the New York Daily News, and he's different in the sense he's a man and he works at a newspaper, but the stories are still the kind of the rip from the headlines. And as I said at the beginning, I've made a couple of appearances both at the bookstore itself and then also at events that Deb, the owner, has run, and we've had some great times there, and she's been super supportive. And I've met the interesting thing about the bookstore is, like, you meet some of the same people each time, because it's a real dedicated group of people who show up at this thing. And I've had people come up and say, "Oh, that was great, but you didn't. What about that story you told last time?" I'm like, okay, So I really look forward to being able to do that again. And I'm in New York, so it's a nice little drive out there. It takes me to a whole other area outside New York. But right now, of course, we're all here in New York anyway. We're all still stuck inside.
Absolutely. Well, we're looking forward to seeing you again, Dick. If they want to learn more about you and your books, where can they find you?
Well, my website is www.rgbelsky.com, just like it sounds. And most of the latest stuff will be there, including links to buy and events and things like that. I'm on Facebook as RG Belsky. I'm on Facebook as Dick Belsky, but I'm also RG Belsky is my author page, so you can find me either way there. And on Twitter as it's a little weird. It's at Dick Bell. DICK and then capital BEL, and that's the Twitter handle. So I think you'll find more than enough information about me there. Or you can Google me, as I say. You'll find a lot about the books, and you'll find a few things about Headless Body and Topless Bar, and a few other journalistic events along the way too. So I've been around. I had a bit of history, so hopefully people will find it all interesting.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Dick, it was much fun talking with you. I know we didn't even get into some of the other stuff we wanted to talk about, the true crime cases, the Mick Jagger anecdote, but we could save that for next time. Okay?
That's right. And OJ.
And oh,
OJ.
Gosh. Yes, OJ too. I mean, we could have gone for another 20 minutes on all this. So,
well, tell Deb to You invite me back as soon as the bookstores open, and I'll tell all the stories again.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. And this is Bill
Thanks,
Peschel,
Bill.
and this is the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop presents A Conversation with Dick Belsky. Dick, thank you very much, and have a great day. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.